It was a Sunday morning like any other in Maple Grove, Alabama, a town where people still wave from porches, church bells still rang on time, and gossip usually revolved around bake sales or football games. But at 10:14 a.m., the dispatcher at the county sheriff's office picked up a call that would rewrite the town's history. 911, what's your emergency? A woman's voice came through, shaky, trembling, thick with something that sounded more like heartbreak than fear. I shot my mother and my son. The dispatcher froze, eyes flicking toward the supervisor's desk. Ma'am, what did you say? Silence. Then, almost as a whisper, my mother was pregnant with his baby. For a full second, nobody spoke. Then chaos. Units scrambled. Sirens wailed. And 15 minutes later, the quietest house on Willow Street, the small blue one tucked beneath pecan trees, became a crime scene swarming with flashing lights. When first responders stepped onto the front porch, the air was still thick with the smell of coffee and cornbread. The swing outside creaked gently in the wind, as if time hadn't caught up with the horror inside. The front door was ajar. The living room was spotless, lined with porcelain angels and family photos, birthdays, graduations, holidays, moments frozen in perfect smiles. Then came the kitchen. Two bodies sat slumped at the dining table, still wearing their Sunday best. A floral dress, a white button-down shirt. The table was set for lunch, plates half filled with scrambled eggs, biscuits, and peach preserves. A crystal wine glass lay shattered on the floor. Blood had pooled across the lace tablecloth, seeping into the wood below. And above it, hanging neatly on the wall, was a framed cross-stitch that read, "Family is God's greatest gift." Sitting on the floor nearby, her back pressed against the kitchen island, was Marion Whitmore, 52 years old, her knees pulled to her chest. In her lap, a small handgun. Her eyes were swollen, her hair matted with sweat. She didn't look like a killer. She looked like a woman who had been holding her breath for years and finally exhaled. "I couldn't let that baby be born," she murmured to the officers who entered. "You don't understand. You can't understand." The victims were soon identified. Evelyn Grace Whitmore, 91, the family matriarch, and her grandson, Lucas Whitmore, 21, a student at Auburn University. Lucas was miraculously still alive, a bullet wound through his shoulder, his blood staining the floor beside his grandmother's body. Paramedics rushed him out on a stretcher as Mary Ann sat motionless, watching her son disappear through the open doorway. Neighbors gathered behind the yellow tape, whispering in disbelief. "She was the sweetest old lady," one woman said. "They were always on that porch together, gardening, talking, laughing." No one could reconcile the peaceful grandmother they knew with the twisted reality police were beginning to uncover. Inside the house, nothing appeared out of place. No sign of a robbery, no struggle, just a life interrupted mid-sentence. One officer found a pink envelope in the center of the dining table, untouched by blood. Written in elegant cursive, Hope Marie Whitmore. It was the unborn baby's name. By noon, word had spread across Maple Grove. Phones buzzed, church bells fell silent, and TV vans began to roll into town. To outsiders, it sounded like a grotesque headline. Alabama woman kills mother and son in incest pregnancy scandal. But to the people of Maple Grove, it was personal. Everyone knew the Whitmores. Evelyn had taught Sunday school for 40 years. Lucas played piano for the youth choir. Marion volunteered at the library. If there was one family no one expected to see on the evening news, it was theirs. As officers escorted Mary Ann from the house, she kept repeating a single phrase, "I just wanted my family back." Behind her, the coroner zipped up the second body bag. That afternoon, Sheriff's Deputy Cole Harper briefed the press. At approximately 10:14 a.m., we received a 911 call from Mrs. Marion Whitmore admitting to a double shooting. One victim deceased on scene, one in critical condition. Motive under investigation. But in truth, no one could have imagined the motive waiting to be uncovered. A secret so taboo, so morally shattering, that even seasoned detectives struggled to write it in their reports. A 91-year-old woman, her 21-year-old grandson, a pregnancy that defied biology, ethics, and sanity. And at the center of it all, a mother caught between love, shame, and something she could only call mercy. The morning Evelyn Grace Whitmore collapsed, sunlight was spilling across her kitchen counters, catching on a row of mason jars filled with sugar and flour. She was rolling biscuit dough the way she'd done for 70 years, slow, steady, singing an old hymn under her breath. Then, without warning, the bowl slipped from her hands. She gasped, clutched her stomach, and hit the floor. 10 minutes later, her grandson Lucas found her. His 911 call sounded panicked, but oddly composed for a 21-year-old. "My grandma's burning up," he said. "She just fainted. Please hurry." By the time paramedics reached the house, Evelyn was awake again, insisting she was fine. Still, they loaded her into the ambulance while she protested about her unfinished biscuits. At Jefferson County General, doctors expected to find the usual culprits: dehydration, maybe a mini stroke. But every test came back normal until one lab technician frowned at her screen. "Her HCG levels are elevated," she murmured. The attending physician blinked. "That's impossible. She's 91. They reran the test. Same result. So they ordered an ultrasound, and when the image flickered onto the screen, the entire ER went silent. A gestational sac, unmistakable and real. "Get Dr. Rowe," someone whispered. Dr. Patricia Rowe, a seasoned OB/GYN who'd seen everything from triplets to tragedies, entered the room holding the file and shaking hands. Evelyn sat upright on the hospital bed, sipping ginger ale and chatting with a nurse about her pecan pie recipe. "Mrs. Whitmore," Dr. Rowe began carefully, "I need to ask you something a bit personal. Have you been sexually active recently?" Evelyn smiled, eyes bright behind her glasses. "Well, sugar, I'm maybe 91, but I'm not dead." Rowe blinked, unsure whether to laugh or cry. She stepped into the hallway to find 3 doctors arguing about equipment malfunction and lab contamination. But there was no mistake. The woman in room 214 was pregnant. Hospital policy demanded a second opinion. When another OB/GYN confirmed the finding, disbelief turned into chaos. One doctor threatened to call the state board. Another muttered that someone was playing a sick prank. Evelyn remained perfectly calm. When the sheriff's deputy arrived to ask routine questions, she offered him sweet tea and said politely, "You don't have to look so shocked. Lucas is a grown man. We love each other." The deputy thought she was delusional. He wrote it down anyway. Within 24 hours, Jefferson County General became a fortress of secrecy. Administrators banned staff from talking to the press. Security guards were posted outside the maternity ward. Reporters still found out. The headline hit the next morning. 91-year-old Alabama woman pregnant. Grandson confirmed as father. And just like that, the Whitmores were no longer a family. They were a national spectacle. When police questioned Lucas, he didn't deny it. He sat in the interrogation room, pale but composed, and said, "We never planned this. It just happened." To investigators, it sounded like madness. To him, it was truth. "She loved me when no one else did," he explained. "When I looked at her, I didn't see a grandmother. I saw the only person who's ever truly known me." It wasn't lust, he claimed. It was peace. The kind of love that made the rest of the world fade away. Psychologists later called it trauma-bonded dependency. 2 lonely people trapped in the same house, confusing comfort for devotion. But at that moment, Lucas didn't care about diagnoses. He said Evelyn had asked for one last gift before she left this world, and he had given it to her. Back in Maple Grove, people whispered behind church pews and grocery aisles. Was it abuse? Dementia? Some twisted miracle? Evelyn's neighbors, women she'd baked for and prayed with for decades, crossed the street to avoid her porch. Still, she refused to hide. Sitting in her rocking chair, a soft floral shawl around her shoulders, she rubbed the small curve of her stomach and smiled for the cameras. "It's the greatest miracle of my life," she told a reporter from the Birmingham Herald. "I never thought I'd be a mother again, and certainly not with someone I love so deeply." She called the baby Hope Marie Whitmore. Doctors struggled to explain how such a pregnancy was even possible. Later, records revealed that Evelyn had been receiving experimental hormone injections through an anti-aging clinic in Florida, treatments that reactivated dormant reproductive cells. Whether she understood what she was signing up for remained unclear. But one thing was certain: she wanted this child. Her daughter Mary Ann, watching the chaos unfold from North Carolina, could only stare at the TV in disbelief. The mother who once led Sunday prayers was now the face of a moral scandal shaking the entire state. And as the news anchors debated science, sin, and sanity, Mary Ann packed her bags and whispered, "If nobody else will stop this, I will." Before the headlines, before the baby showers and the protests, the Whitmore family had been Maple Grove's quiet example of grace. People called Evelyn Grace Whitmore Miss Evie, the woman who never missed a Sunday sermon, who baked banana bread for every funeral, and who still sent handwritten birthday cards to kids who'd moved away decades ago. If you had told her neighbors that she'd one day be accused of carrying her grandson's child, they would have laughed. Not Evelyn, they'd say. She's as pure as the church piano. But the truth, as it often is in small towns, was more complicated and far more human. After her husband Harold died in 1994, Evelyn had lived alone in the same blue house on Willow Street. She kept it spotless, lace curtains, polished silver, a garden that could have been in Southern living. But the loneliness was heavy. She never remarried, not because she couldn't, but because no one ever looked at her the way she longed to be seen. Neighbors thought she was content with her roses and recipes. They didn't see the silence that crept in after sunset, the way she'd sit by the window with an untouched cup of tea, humming old hymns just to hear a voice in the house. Then, 2 years before the scandal, Evelyn suffered a mild stroke. It left her unsteady for a while, enough for her daughter, Mary Ann, to insist that someone stay with her. That's when Lucas came home. Lucas had always been the sensitive one. A piano major at Auburn University, soft-spoken, gentle, never quite fitting in with the other boys. He'd grown up spending summers at his grandmother's, sitting beside her on the porch swing, listening to her tell stories about faith, family, and the way love used to mean something sacred. When he moved back in after her stroke, everyone praised him. "What a sweet boy," they said. "That's how family should be, taking care of their own." For a while, that's all it was, care. Lucas cooked her breakfast, installed a chair lift on the staircase, read to her when her eyes got tired. The house came alive again. Music from his piano drifting through the halls, Evelyn's laughter returning after years of quiet. But somewhere between the morning devotionals and the late-night lullabies, the lines blurred. One winter night, Lucas came home heartbroken after a breakup with a girl from college. He sat on the couch, eyes wet, voice shaking. "She said I'm too strange," he whispered, "that I feel things too deeply." Evelyn took his hand. "There's nothing wrong with feeling deeply, sweetheart. That's what makes us human." He rested his head against her chest like he had when he was a child. She stroked his hair. "You'll always have me," she said softly. It was supposed to be comfort. But comfort, when left unchecked, can turn into something else, something both tender and terrifying. What began as small gestures, holding hands during prayers, late-night talks by the piano, grew into an intimacy neither of them could name. They told themselves it was love, the kind God must understand. But the world would never see it that way. Evelyn, in her journal, wrote, "He looks at me like the woman I used to be. For once, I'm not invisible." Lucas, in one of his music notebooks, scribbled a line that prosecutors would later read aloud in court. "She's not my grandmother. She's my home." To the outside world, it was unthinkable. To them, it was inevitable. Psychologists later called it a closed circuit of loneliness, two souls trapped in isolation, mistaking desperation for destiny. Evelyn saw in Lucas the affection she'd been denied for decades. Lucas saw in her the unconditional love his mother could never give. When she discovered she was pregnant, Evelyn called it divine. "God gave Sarah a child at 90, she told Dr. Rowe. "Why not me?" Lucas didn't flinch when the test confirmed he was the father. He took her hand and said, "Then we'll raise her together." They chose a name, Hope Marie. By the time neighbors started whispering, the pair had already crossed every line society drew. They walked arm in arm to the local church, sat together in the back pew, heads bowed. But when word spread, the stares began. The pastor stopped calling. The women's group stopped visiting. And still, Evelyn refused to apologize. Love isn't shameful, she told anyone who dared confront her. It's just misunderstood. Lucas nodded beside her, quiet but defiant. In their minds, the world had turned its back, but they still had each other. By the end of that week, the town of Maple Grove wasn't just whispering, it was boiling. What started as murmurs in the church parking lot had turned into a wildfire of outrage that no one could contain. The Maple Grove Gazette ran the headline first. 91-year-old woman pregnant. Grandson confirmed as father. By dawn, it was everywhere. CNN, Fox, morning talk shows, podcasts. Every host had a theory. Every viewer had an opinion. Was it abuse? Was it a medical miracle? Or was it something darker? A story about loneliness dressed up as love? Outside Evelyn's blue house on Willow Street, satellite trucks parked bumper to bumper. Reporters shouted questions from her driveway. The neighbors pulled their blinds down, but everyone was watching. Evelyn didn't hide. She refused to. One afternoon, she stepped out onto her porch in a floral dress and pearls, the Alabama sun catching the silver in her hair. Cameras clicked as she smiled, one hand resting on the gentle swell of her stomach. "It's the greatest blessing of my life," she told a stunned reporter. "I prayed for purpose, and God sent me one." When asked about the child's father, she said it as simply as if she were reading a grocery list. "Lucas, my grandson. But more than that, he's my companion. He's my heart." The clip went viral within hours. In living rooms across America, people argued over dinner. On Reddit, threads exploded. On Facebook, church groups split down the middle. Half the country called her a victim, an elderly woman manipulated by her grandson. The other half saw something else, a woman defying judgment, claiming the right to love on her own terms. In reality, neither side was right, and both were. For Lucas, the spotlight was unbearable. He'd always been quiet, the kind of boy who let music say what he couldn't. Now, strangers online dissected his every gesture, every word, every photo. Monster. Predator. Sick. He turned off his phone, deleted his social media, and retreated to the only place he felt safe, behind the piano in the living room. Evelyn would sit beside him, eyes closed, humming along as he played. "It's us against the world," she told him. "They can't understand what they haven't felt." He nodded, tears sliding down his face. 2 weeks later, Evelyn hosted a baby shower in her backyard. She invited the entire neighborhood, though only 2 guests came, and one was a reporter. The yard was decorated with pink balloons and paper hearts. A banner stretched across the porch. "Welcome, Hope Marie." Evelyn wore a soft pink maternity dress, her hands trembling as she cut the cake. Lucas stood beside her, smiling nervously at the cameras. At one point, he placed his hand over her stomach and whispered something that made her laugh. A photo of that moment hit the internet within hours. It became the most shared image in the country for 3 days. To some it was love. To others, blasphemy. Church leaders called it an abomination. Alabama lawmakers debated new elder protection laws. Talk show hosts invited psychologists to diagnose what the world was watching in real time. Meanwhile, Marion Whitmore, Evelyn's daughter, Lucas's mother, sat in a motel room 2 states away, staring at the TV. Every new headline was another stab to the heart. She could hardly recognize the woman on screen. The same mother who once taught her Bible verses about purity and sin now stood proudly, belly round, quoting scripture about miracles. Marianne screamed into a pillow. "It's not a miracle," she whispered. "It's madness." The noise grew louder by the day. Some viewers romanticized the story, calling it the Alabama Romeo and Juliet. Others sent threats and hate mail to the Whitmore home. Protesters gathered outside with signs that read, "Incest is not love," and "Protect the unborn from sin." Someone threw a brick through the front window one night. Evelyn swept up the glass herself and hung a new sign by the door, "Love lives here." Through it all, Lucas stayed by her side. He cooked her meals, read to her at night, and played piano until dawn. "As long as we're together," he said, "none of it matters." But it did matter to the world, to the church, and most of all, to the one person who couldn't look away any longer. Because while the cameras rolled and the world argued, Marianne was already on her way home. And in her suitcase wasn't just a change of clothes. It was a gun. When Marion Whitmore pulled into Maple Grove that humid August afternoon, the air itself felt heavier, like even the town was holding its breath. It had been years since she'd been back. The familiar streets looked smaller now, stranger. Every mailbox, every porch swing felt like a reminder of something she couldn't get back. She parked 2 blocks away from her mother's blue house on Willow Street and just sat there. The radio was off. The only sound was the faint hum of cicadas and the erratic beating of her heart. Through the windshield, she could see it. Her childhood home, now surrounded by news vans and strangers with cameras. And on the porch, in that same rocking chair where she used to sit with scraped knees and ice cream cones, was Evelyn, her 91-year-old mother, visibly pregnant, hand resting proudly on her stomach. Beside her stood Lucas, shirtless in the heat, holding a glass of lemonade. He bent down, rubbed lotion on her swollen belly, and kissed her forehead. Marianne's breath caught. Her hands trembled on the steering wheel. She felt the air drain out of her lungs as if she were drowning. That was her mother. That was her son. And the child growing inside that frail body was both her sibling and her grandchild. She almost vomited. Later, in her statement to police, Marianne said it felt like watching a nightmare play out in broad daylight. She waited an hour before she found the courage to step out of the car and walk to the porch. She could hear her own footsteps crunching against the gravel, each one heavier than the last. When she reached the door, it was Lucas who answered. "Hey, Mom," he said, smiling as if nothing were wrong. "What is this?" Her voice cracked. Evelyn appeared behind him, dressed in a floral nightgown, her hair pinned neatly like she was ready for Sunday service. "It's our baby," she said softly. "Isn't it beautiful?" Marianne's words came out like broken glass. "That's my mother, Lucas. You slept with my mother." Lucas's tone hardened. "You don't understand. We're in love." "She's 91, Marianne screamed. "You're 21. This is sick." "It's not wrong if it's love," Evelyn whispered from the doorway. Marianne turned and walked away, her face wet with tears. She drove straight to the sheriff's office, but the law offered no comfort. The deputy looked at her with pity when she tried to explain. "They're both adults," he said gently. "There's no statute covering this. We can't charge them. You're telling me it's not illegal for a 91-year-old to sleep with her grandson?" "Ma'am," he said quietly, "not if both are of sound mind and consent." Marianne left shaking. The world she thought she knew, the one where morality had boundaries and family meant safety, was gone. The next few weeks were a blur of humiliation and helplessness. Everywhere she turned, her family was a headline. CNN replayed clips of Evelyn smiling for cameras, cradling her belly like a prize. Social media flooded with memes and mockery. Talk shows called it the Alabama apocalypse. Marianne stopped sleeping. She started drinking. She kept a notebook beside her bed filled with prayers and confessions, some written in shaky pen strokes at 3 a.m. "I'm losing them both. The devil doesn't always come in the form of hate. Sometimes he comes dressed as love. I keep waiting for someone to stop this, but no one will." Each day, she called her son. Each time, he refused to listen. "She loves me, Mom," Lucas said. "She always has." "She raised you, Lucas," Marianne cried. "She wiped your nose. She held you as a baby. She's supposed to protect you, not touch you." "You're just jealous," he whispered before hanging up. That word, jealous, echoed in her skull until it rotted into something else, fury. When Evelyn announced a second baby shower, open to the public, Marianne knew she couldn't take it anymore. She dreamed of fire, of blood, of her mother rocking a newborn that should never have existed. She started hearing her younger self's voice, the little girl her mother once held on the back porch, whispering, "Be strong. Be a woman of God." And so, she decided to be strong by ending what she saw as evil. On September 3rd, she drove to a gun shop just outside town. She told the clerk she needed protection. He didn't ask from what. 2 days later, she packed the weapon in her purse and drove to Willow Street. Before getting out of the car, she looked at herself in the mirror, eyes swollen, hair undone, lips trembling, and whispered, "You're not here to kill them. You're here to make them understand." But deep down, she already knew that was a lie. Because sometimes love doesn't just blind you, it breaks you. And Marianne Whitmore had reached her breaking point. By the time Marianne Whitmore stood trial in February 2025, the state of Alabama versus Marianne Whitmore had already become the most polarizing case in the South since the Casey Anthony era. The story had everything the media craved: scandal, faith, taboo, and a woman the public couldn't decide whether to pity or condemn. Outside the courthouse in Montgomery, protesters crowded both sides of the street. On one end, handmade signs read, "Justice for Evelyn," and "No mercy for murder." On the other, a smaller group held candles and Bibles, whispering, "She did what the law refused to do." Inside, cameras were banned, but every seat was filled. The air felt like static. Reporters scribbled every word as the judge, Helen Calhoun, called the court to order. "We are not here to debate morality," she reminded the jury. "We are here to decide the law." But everyone in that room knew morality was exactly what was on trial. The prosecution went first. District Attorney Raymond Hart, a broad-shouldered man with a preacher's cadence, painted Marianne as a cold-blooded executioner who played God in her mother's kitchen. He showed photos of the crime scene, the lace tablecloth soaked in blood, the pink envelope addressed Hope Marie. Jurors looked away. One woman in the back row wept. Hart's voice thundered through the courtroom. This was not mercy. This was murder. Plain and simple. A 91-year-old woman and her unborn child, gunned down because one woman decided her version of right was above the law. Then he turned toward the jury box, pointing a finger. "And if we excuse that today, what's to stop anyone else from doing the same tomorrow?" It was powerful, practiced, and chilling. But when defense attorney Carla Brewster rose from her chair, the temperature in the room seemed to shift. She was calm, her voice low, deliberate, the kind that made people lean in to listen. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "this is not the story of a murderer. This is the story of a mother watching her family dissolve in slow motion, abandoned by the law, ridiculed by the world, and left to carry the weight of a nightmare no one else would stop." She didn't deny the shooting. Instead, she reframed it, calling it an act of moral collapse, not malice. She introduced expert witnesses, psychologists, theologians, and trauma specialists who testified about moral injury, the psychological condition where witnessing acts that violate one's deepest values can lead to a dissociative break. One expert said Marianne's mind snapped under a perfect storm of shame, helplessness, and public humiliation. Then came Lucas, thin, pale, and visibly shaken. He took the stand on the third day of the trial. A soft brace wrapped his healing shoulder. When asked to describe what happened, he hesitated. "She came in angry," he said quietly. "She told us to stop. I tried to calm her down." "Did your mother say anything before she fired the first shot?" He swallowed hard. "Yeah," she said, "if God won't stop you, maybe I have to." The courtroom went silent. Then the defense cross-examined him. Brewster's voice softened. "Lucas, do you believe your mother hated you?" "No," he whispered. "She just couldn't live with what we'd done." He looked at the jury, eyes glassy. She wasn't trying to kill evil. She was trying to kill shame. After that, the trial became less about bullets and more about beliefs. Pastors debated scripture on courthouse steps. Talk shows asked if morality should ever outweigh law. Families argued at dinner tables about who the real victim was. For the jurors, it was suffocating. When closing arguments came, Hart reminded them of the law, murder, plain and simple. But Brewster reminded them of something else. "What do we call it?" she asked, "when a person watches their world decay and loses their mind trying to save it? Is that evil? Or is that human?" On March 1st, 2025, after 11 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with its verdict. Guilty of 2 counts of manslaughter. Not guilty of attempted murder. Marianne sat perfectly still. No tears, no outburst, just the faintest nod, as if she'd been expecting it all along. Judge Calhoun's voice echoed as she read the sentence. 37 years in state prison with eligibility for parole after 22. The courtroom murmured. Some gasped. Others applauded. Outside, the crowd erupted, half in anger, half in sympathy. One sign caught the camera's attention that evening. She killed sin, not people. That night, news anchors called it the verdict that split the South. Church leaders argued whether justice or mercy had truly been served. And somewhere in a hospital miles away, Lucas Whitmore watched the verdict alone. The TV flickered across his bandaged face. He turned off the sound, sat down at the piano, and began to play. The courthouse steps emptied slowly that night, the echo of the verdict still hanging in the air. Flashing cameras faded, protest signs drooped in the drizzle, and the Whitmore name, once synonymous with grace and good manners, became something whispered, not spoken. Evelyn Grace Whitmore was gone. Hope Marie Whitmore had never lived. And Marion Whitmore, the daughter who fired the gun, was now prisoner number 84721 at the Montgomery Correctional Facility. But one person still remained, Lucas. He was the only one left to carry what was left of their story. Months after the trial, Lucas rarely spoke. Reporters hounded him for interviews. Documentary producers waived contracts, but he turned them all down. He'd moved out of Maple Grove, sold the house, and settled in a one-bedroom apartment above a piano shop in Birmingham. The neighbors described him as quiet, polite, sad. He taught piano lessons to children from a nearby elementary school. Patience, gentle, never raising his voice. But sometimes, after dark, people heard music drifting from his window. Soft, broken melodies, always unfinished, like conversations that never found their ending. He named the piece he was working on Cradle Made of Silence. In his notebook, beside the unfinished sheet music, he wrote just 4 words. For her. For them. Maple Grove tried to move on, but it never really did. The blue house on Willow Street sat empty for nearly a year before the bank repossessed it. The new owners painted it gray, tore down the swing, and planted boxwoods where Evelyn's roses once grew. But locals swore that on quiet nights, you could still hear faint piano notes drifting down the street. The church that once expelled Evelyn reopened its doors for a memorial service. No cameras, no reporters, just a handful of elderly women who'd once sat beside her in pews. The pastor read a single verse. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Then they bowed their heads in silence. No one mentioned her pregnancy. No one dared to say the word love. Marianne adjusted quickly to prison life, not with defiance, but with a quiet resignation that unsettled the guards. She didn't join cliques, didn't pick fights, didn't cry. She spent her days in the prison chapel, sweeping floors and polishing pews, as though still trying to cleanse something she couldn't see. Each Sunday, she wrote a letter, not to reporters or lawyers, but to Lucas. I don't ask for forgiveness, she wrote in one. I only ask that you live, that you do what none of us could, make peace with the past. He never wrote back, but he kept every letter in a small wooden box beside his piano. When a journalist later asked why, he simply said, because she was my mother before she was my judge. In March 2026, exactly 1 year after the verdict, Lucas organized a small recital in a community church hall. No cameras, no ticket sales, just locals and a few curious strangers. He walked onto the stage wearing a black suit that hung loosely on his thin frame. He didn't speak. He just sat down, took a deep breath, and began to play. The music started soft, like a lullaby, but carried a strange ache beneath it. The melody built, fractured, then circled back on itself, echoing themes of longing, loss, and something deeper. Surrender. When he reached the final note, he rested his hands on the keys, trembling. Tears rolled down his cheeks. Her name, he whispered, was Hope Marie. The crowd didn't clap. They just sat in silence, some crying, others holding their children a little closer. That performance, the only one he ever gave, was recorded on a phone by a young girl in the audience. Within days, it spread online under the title, The Man Who Played for His Mother, His Grandmother, and his child. It became a quiet phenomenon. Years later, a small plaque appeared in the garden beside Maple Groves Community Center. It was simple, No mention of scandal or tragedy. In memory of Hope Marie Whitmore, a life never born, but never forgotten. Beneath it, children planted flowers every spring. Most didn't even know the full story. They just knew that once a family here had loved each other so much it destroyed them. In 2042, at age 69, Mary Ann was released on parole for medical reasons. By then, she was frail, her hair silver, her voice barely above a whisper. She moved to a quiet hospice outside Montgomery, where a nurse described her as a woman still praying for something that never came. In her final days, she asked for one thing: to hear Cradle Made of Silence. The hospice staff reached out to Lucas, now in his 40s. He didn't come, but he sent a recording. The music played softly in her room as she passed away. Her last words were barely audible. "Tell him, I understand now." Years later, the recording of Cradle Made of Silence will be played at university lectures about trauma and forgiveness. It became part of documentaries, podcasts, even sermons. Scholars debated its meaning. Some called it a requiem for guilt, others a confession in melody. But those who listened closely said there was something else in it, a heartbeat. Slow, constant, like a lullaby for someone who never took her first breath. Lucas never remarried, never gave another interview. In his final years, he taught underprivileged kids how to play piano, telling them, "Music doesn't fix you. It just makes the pain bearable." When he died in 2058, at the age of 55, his students placed a single pink envelope on his piano. Inside was a handwritten note: for hope, for silence, for love that should have ended but never did. The Whitmore tragedy faded from headlines, but not from memory. Every few years, a true crime documentary or podcast would revive the story. The 91-year-old grandmother who carried her grandson's child, the daughter who pulled the trigger, the baby who became a symbol. And yet, beyond the shock, beyond the sin, one truth remained. This was never really a story about incest or murder. It was a story about what happens when love becomes desperate, when loneliness turns divine, and when faith collides with flesh.